Working at the crematorium wasn't exactly the most glamorous job, but hey, it paid the bills, and that's what counted, right? Plus, I wasn't exactly miserable working there. I've never exactly been the most social guy, so at least I wasn't dealing with a lot of people. Living people, at least. And technically speaking, the work wasn't all that different from sorting files at an office job. You had to check the tags on the bodies, make sure everything was where it needed to be, place one corpse in, clean one of the machines for another corpse, collect the ashes, and make sure they're ready to go to the grieving family. Now, admittedly, it could be a little grosser than an office job at times. When a body was severely decomposed or when we had a medical cadaver who'd been taken apart, that was always messy. But I learned to get desensitized to that really quickly. I got desensitized to a lot of things. The smell of burning flesh, human ashes on my clothes, and the uncomfortable truth in the back of my mind that I'd been breathing in dead people for the past few years. Most days I was working with one or two other people. There was my manager and another guy who helped with the cremations. We usually worked alternating shifts, but every now and then we'd overlap. But every now and then I'd have days where I was working alone, and honestly, I liked those days. It used to bother me at first, being alone in a building with a bunch of dead bodies I was supposed to burn, but like everything else, in time, I grew desensitized to it. It was just another part of the job. Simple as that. I was strong enough to lift most of the bodies we got in, so I could manage on my own just fine. Up until recently, I've never had any problems. But then, there's the key word. Recently. It was one of the days when I was working alone. We had 5 bodies to burn and 3 machines. I had already put 2 of the bodies into the machines and was waiting for them to finish. It takes about 2 hours for a body to burn, and even when they do, they don't burn completely. You're left with parts of the spine, hip bones, skull, and even part of the brain. Brains don't really burn well. Anyways, I'd been prepping the 3rd machine for our 3rd customer when I heard it, something I'd never heard before. Now, bodies make sounds when they burn. They might grunt, hiss, or even moan. These are just the sounds of gases escaping the body. It's an ugly part of decomposition nobody really talks about, but I've mostly learned to tune the sounds out. Like I said before, I've grown desensitized to a lot. But here's the thing. Of all the sounds I've ever heard while cremating a body, I've never once heard one scream. I've heard urban legends about them screaming, sure, but I've never actually heard one scream. My understanding was that it was just some freaky tale that people told each other to make the prospect of death even scarier. Because, death needs to be scarier, I guess. But when I heard the screaming that day, well, I actually thought it was coming from outside. I stepped away for a bit, wondering if maybe something had happened out on the street. But as I got further away from the machines, the screaming grew fainter. It couldn't be coming from the streets. It had to be coming from one of the machines. My attention was drawn to the bodies I'd put in, and now that I was listening for it, I could hear it. The faint sound of screaming coming from inside. Truth be told, it didn't scare me. If anything, I was fascinated. I'd never heard a dead body do that before. I checked the ID I'd taken off the body I'd put inside. Phyllis Dunn, a little old lady who'd come in the day before. She'd weighed less than 100 pounds when I put her on the conveyor belt leading to the machine about 45 minutes earlier, and she'd most definitely been dead. Dunn had seemingly died of some sort of fall and had a pretty nasty gash on the side of her head. She'd been dead for a while, too. Advanced decomposition hadn't set in yet, but with the state she was in, I wouldn't have wanted anyone who loved her to see her. She looked dead. I could tell. This was weird. I would not have expected a lady like that to make that kind of sound, but all the same, I guess. I shrugged it off, figuring the screaming would stop soon. I made a mental note to ask my boss about it later. Maybe it was just air escaping from her lungs or something. Who could say for sure? I went back to my 3rd machine to finish preparing the body, hoping that maybe I could catch a short break while I waited for the other bodies to finish up. I was nearly done and just about ready to hit the button to send the last body into the machine when I heard something else I'd never heard before. The sound of someone knocking on the inside of one of the machines. I paused. Before going back to Phyllis Dunn's machine, she must have been in there for an hour at that point. Her body had to be little more than a charred skeleton. I could vaguely see the shape of a corpse through the flames, but it was hard to tell if it was moving or not. Of course it wasn't moving. Phyllis Dunn had been dead, for Christ's sake. Unless maybe it was some sort of nerve spasm, or maybe an issue with the machine itself. The banging came again. I saw sharp and sudden movement inside the machine. The screaming started up again, still muffled by the inside of the machine, but it was clearly coming from Phyllis. I took a step back, starting to feel a little uneasy now. The wall of flames made it hard to tell for sure, but I could have sworn that body moved. No, it had to just be my imagination. Dead bodies don't fucking move. And yet, the banging was still there, growing more and more frantic. The screaming seemed to grow more frantic as well, and the longer I stood there, the more I began to second guess if Phyllis Dunn had really been dead when I put her in the machine. She looked like she'd been starting to decompose. She'd had that gash in the side of her head. She looked dead. Maybe this was the wrong body in the wrong machine. Maybe it wasn't Phyllis. I looked over at the other machine. The occupant of that one was Cameron Patrick, a middle-aged man who died in a car accident. He'd also very clearly been dead. Looking into his machine, he didn't seem to be moving either. The banging from Phyllis grew louder and more aggressive, and finally, I heard it. A low, raspy voice that was muffled by the machine that was burning her. 3 words I'd never thought I'd actually hear. Let me out. The voice quaked, its tone either afraid or angry. I wasn't sure which might have scared me more. My heart was racing. She'd been burning for an hour. She couldn't still be alive. As far as I could tell, she was little more than a skeleton. She had to be dead. She had to be dead. But the voice was still there. Let me out. The tone was more commanding this time, and yet more panicked. I took a step back, my hands shaking as I tried to figure out what to do. Maybe this was a prank. It had to be a prank. My manager or the other guy who came in, they had to be playing a joke on me. Let me out. Let me out. The voice screamed. The pounding grew louder. I looked around, half hoping to see some evidence that this wasn't real, but I didn't see anything. Just an empty crematorium and the thrashing shape inside one of the machines. Let me out! Let me out! Let me out! The pounding kept growing louder, until the door to the machine shook violently. I jumped back a step. Something hit the door again, causing it to buckle. Flames erupted out the sides. Smoke started to fill the room as whatever was inside the machine struck the door again, forcing it open. Tongues of flame licked at the air outside of the machine. The searing heat washed over my face as I realized that there was no way this could be a prank. Phyllis Dunn was coming out. I could see a shadow moving through the flames. In the inferno, I could sense eyes watching me. And then I heard that impossible voice again, low and raspy, completely stripped of any humanity. My name. She knew my name. I stumbled backward, watching as a pair of charred, skeletal hands emerged from the machine. I didn't wait around to see the rest of what was attached to them. I turned and ran, tripping over myself as I sprinted towards the door. The smoke alarm had gone off. By the time I'd reached the door, the sprinklers had activated. I just kept running until I burst through the door and onto the street. And even once I saw the sun, I still kept running until my body couldn't take it anymore. By the time the firefighters were able to put out the flames, the crematorium was nothing but a charred skeleton of a building. Officially, one of the machines malfunctioned. It was nobody's fault. My boss was a little pissed at me for running the way I did, but brushed it off as me going into a panic. He's half right. If nothing else, the bodies we were burning that day got burned. They found remains they could tie to 4 of the 5 cadavers we'd had on site. The last one, Phyllis Dunn, was presumed to have been completely incinerated in the blaze. Yeah, I don't know if I believe that. I've handed in my resignation. I'm going to look for work elsewhere. If my next employer asks me about the gap on my resume, I'm going to tell them that the crematorium job just proved too much for me. It won't exactly be a lie, Just to be safe, I've also made plans to move to a new town, far away from where I used to live. Maybe Phyllis Dunn has no interest in me. After all, I'm just the guy who worked at the crematorium. Maybe whatever unfinished business she has that made her climb out of her own cremation doesn't involve me at all. It probably doesn't. And I'm going to keep telling myself that until I believe it. But until I'm sure, I'm not going to take any chances for a little while. Personally, I'm not ready to see the inside of one of those machines for myself. I used to work the night shift at the hospital. There's a reason they call it the graveyard shift. But that's another story. I don't particularly like the place, but they pay well, so I can't complain too much about being the lucky guy who gets to clean up the operating rooms after an operation. At least I had some company. His name is Joe, and he's not very outgoing. I had to ask one of the other janitors to find out his name. He likes to keep to himself, and I've never heard him talk. He's a big guy, and he has the job of mopping the hallways. He does a good job, but that's mostly because he mops so slowly and methodically that he can't possibly miss a spot. Joe is a bit of an odd bird. He wears surgical gloves and mask along with a surgical hat and gown. Maybe he's paranoid about germs. The way this hospital is run, who can blame him? Even though he's not very social, it's good to have him around, especially at night when I'm cleaning up the bloody rags and sometimes pieces of botched surgeries that litter the operating room floors. Every once in a while, Joe could be called upon to take one of the bodies down to the morgue. And yes, the morgue is the creepiest place you could possibly imagine. Trust me, you never want to go to the morgue, especially at night. One of the things I learned early on is you never look at the bodies. Your imagination will take over every time and you will see something twitch underneath its sheet. That's why I stopped looking. When I have a delivery, I do it and get the hell out. Sounds? Of course you'll hear sounds. Once again, it's probably your imagination, but every once in a great while there's a twitch or two, and then there's the person who's not quite dead, but that also is another story. You could say I've seen a lot of things during my time here. Some of the most disconcerting is the bloody handprints on the wall. I've never figured out how they get there, but as for my job, I clean it up, punch out, and go home. Do I ever mention anything to the hospital administration? Nope. I discovered long ago that there are things they just don't want to hear about. So I clean it up, keep my mouth shut, and collect my paycheck. On this particular evening, as I rolled my gurney back out of the morgue, my imagination made me think that I heard a thump, a heavy thump. However, the more sensible side of me completely ignored it and kept on pushing the gurney. At a slightly faster speed? Maybe. But nonetheless, I ignored it and went about cleaning the next OR. I became so involved in listening to my music that I never heard the doors of the room open and close again or the footsteps approaching me until it was too late. I turned around and there was a corpse lurching, arms outstretched, mouth open 3 feet from me. I froze with fear, my mind shutting down. This thing didn't seem possible. I was too stunned to defend myself. The horrid stench that emanated from it was nearly enough to finish me off. It approached, teeth bared, inches away from its macabre feast. My mind was paralyzed with fear and utter shock. And then my mind dropped further into denial when Joe burst through the door, lumbered over, grabbed the corpse, twisted its neck until I heard a sickening crunch, then threw it against the wall as if it were a rag doll. The corpse crumpled to the floor as Joe pulled off his mask to reveal a nightmare face of deathly pale skin and sunken cheeks. He seized the corpse and began chewing on its neck. He feasted on the gore of the corpse as he ripped it to pieces. The corpse twitched only twice and then ceased to struggle as Joe devoured it. A few minutes later, Joe stopped, allowed what was left of the body to fall to the floor, and looked straight at me. I'd never seen that look in his eyes before. They were inhuman, fierce, and unnaturally hungry. He advanced, arms reaching toward me. Finally, I could see Joe's face up close. His skin was pale and rotting away like a corpse. His teeth were yellow and mostly gone. As he advanced, I realized how completely helpless I was. I realized that my rescuer had become my doom, and I would soon share the same fate as the unrecognizable pile of gore that lay beside me. And then he stopped. The glaze lifted from his eyes. He looked at me, pulled his mask back over his face, and lumbered over to the body. He grabbed one leg and dragged it out of the room, leaving a trail of blood and body parts. I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was a horrible nightmare, but every time I opened my eyes, the bloody splotch on the wall and the trail of blood were still there. I started mentally updating my resume, eventually finding the strength to get up and shakily walk across the room. When I stepped into the hallway, there was Joe with his back to me, slowly mopping up the trail of blood that led back to the morgue as if it was another boring night. He looked back the hall at me for one moment and then went right back to mopping.